Good morning. This is Axel Merk, President and Chief Investment Officer of Merk Investments. Brief update on the markets, then I'll dive into China, Twitter, and a few other things that are on my mind that try to kind of get you thinking about some issues here. If I look at the markets here, just broadly, the S&P futures are flattish. That said, the Nasdaq is down today, and that's just only down 10, $12 now. It was weaker earlier in the morning. And that's on the backdrop of social media companies being hit a little bit because of the threatened or announced executive order by President Trump. But on the markets here first. Bonds are, well, they're just down 3 ticks now in the US. The 30-year is down 16 ticks. The 3-month LIBOR rate is at 13 basis points. That's the 3-month Treasury is at 30 basis points. The 3-month LIBOR is at 37 basis points. The Fed funds rate is at 5 basis points. Global bonds in Europe, they were a little higher. And mixed in the rest of the world. One of the things I noticed that the Chinese markets wasn't really affected by the increased tensions between the US and China. The CSI 300 was up 1/3%. The Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong was down 72 basis points. In Japan, the market was up 2.33%. In Japan, they announced another trillion stimulus package. That's not a trillion yen, that's $1 trillion. And so another massive stimulus. And equity markets appear to be liking it. You wouldn't know it if you look at the currency. It hasn't really reacted. We're at 107.74, almost flat for the yen. The yen is down 2 basis points right now. The weakest currency on the board is the loonie, the Canadian dollar. That's down 21 basis points. The strongest currency is the Swedish krona. It's up 50 basis points, followed by the New Zealand dollar. And on that note, gold is up. In the spot market is up $11 at 17.20. And now the spread is again wider. That's because the front month has moved forward. So for the futures market, we're at 17.35, up $8 in the futures market. The euro is at 110.35 as I speak here. So yes, stimulus in Japan. So that one kind of $1 trillion doesn't make the headlines anymore. There were too many other things happening, I suppose. Didn't quite make the headlines. Just energy. Before I forget, West Texas is kind of flattish, down now down 0.5%, 32.66. Brent is up 17 basis points at 34.81. All right. Yes, so the big thing that's been in the news is Pompeo, the Secretary of State, saying that they are seriously considering kind of decertifying the special status of Hong Kong from the US, has treated Hong Kong separately from China. And saying, well, with everything that's happening in China, that's not longer going to be the case, quite likely. And some people are still questioning whether the US is going to follow through with it. But this may have just been preempting what the People's Congress in China did today, and pretty much, again, taking further control over Hong Kong. And the folks who say that the US is not going to go further down that road say that that's the one leverage that the US has over China. So we'll see how that plays out. Hong Kong markets were weak recently, but today anyway wasn't too much of a reaction. And clearly, if you are in Hong Kong, it's been a grinding process of kind of being merged with the mainland. And the question is, of course, what does it mean for the financial center? What does it mean for, I mean, there are lots of other questions, but that's what it means from a perspective here of talking about financial markets, which is kind of the role I'm trying to assume here. And the important thing is Hong Kong has elections in the fall, and the Chinese want to show that they are in charge, and so that's part of the reason why they're pursuing what they're pursuing right now. What does it mean, though, for U.S.-China relations in the medium term? And those are very open questions. I don't have a good answer to that. It's in the interest of both of them to continue to kind of grow the economy, and you would think that especially in the current environment, they have no interest in putting any roadblock in place. Now, that said, it's election year in the US. There are also domestic political considerations in China. The one thing to keep about mind about China, it's such a huge economy that if they want to reorient their economy towards a more domestic focus, they have all the ability to do that. And they have lots of incentives to do that right now. Um, and so the question to what extent the global fabric is going to get kind of undone and we're going to become more national, more domestic, and so forth. The Chinese, by the way, are picking battles not just with the US. The Australian dollar yesterday was weak, and it was attributed to increased coal import tariffs. And there has been a bit of a tit for tat between Australia and China, and obviously China is the bigger boy in that club. And so we'll see how that works. Now, global trade is just extremely lucrative, and so that's why it tends to come back. The cost of trading might go up, but we'll see. We'll see what's going to happen. Procurement chains and whatnot certainly will be rethought after the coronavirus. So let's pivot here to social media, to Twitter and whatnot. Yesterday I commented on it briefly. So it is expected that President Trump is going to issue an executive order today to review a law that gives social media companies a immunity, so to speak, based on free speech on what's happening on their platforms. And I'm not a legal expert, but from what I understand, this is Trump obviously cannot change the laws yet, cannot change liability, but he can. It's it. A few months ago, we were at this already. Social media companies are the likely punching bags of the election by both Republicans and Democrats. What's not to love about it when you're a politician to blame social media companies for anything bad that's happening? I'm not saying what social media companies are doing is good or bad, but just from a political point of view, it kind of makes sense to go after them. And so when President Trump um, is saying he is issuing an executive order, even if it doesn't have teeth, it's just an opening salvo in more to come. And Congress may well be very willing to go along with something if that's ever required. We've also seen articles, for example, the Wall Street Journal. Let me just put up my disclosure here that I'm not making any recommendations on any security here. The Wall Street Journal had an article a few days ago where it said that at Facebook there were some internal studies that the site is dividing people rather than uniting people, and then the article suggested that management was ultimately shrugging that off and moving on. And so it's those sort of things that will be the basis for disputes, for arguments down the road, and saying, hey, you guys knew better. What did you do about it? Now, the context is, of course, that you see a lot of stuff that's not right on social media, and then you have people, and the more outrageous you are, the more followers you'll get. And so, if you post something that's wrong and that outrageous, odds are that people like it in the little sense of the button and whatnot. And so the question is it anybody's responsibility to police that or whatever? And then, of course, it's not just you and I and whoever who might be tweeting something. It is policymakers as well, including the president. And then, so obviously, what has happened is the president tweeted something that was wrong, and then Twitter decided to put a tag on it. It's the first time that a politician said something that was wrong, and therefore we're suddenly outraged. Well, obviously, I'm not trying to defend Trump here by any stretch of the imagination. But truth is in the eye of the beholder, and we all look at the world through our lens, and we get outraged by certain things and not by others. And we are all in our own bubble and trying to justify what we get. And somebody pointed out that the head of quote unquote site integrity, that's a title at Twitter, back in 2016 and 2017, posted several highly derogatory comments about the president and Republicans in general. And so just looking at those tweets, and I trying to go to the sources, I actually looked up whether they were made up or whether they were indeed those tweets. They were. And so um, one if one is a Republican, one shall be excused for being offended by having a person like that and be in charge of saying what a Republican should be tweeting or not, a Republican president. And so those are difficult questions. On the face of it, of course, what the president tweeted was wrong, and is of course not the first time that has happened. And so the question is, what is the responsibility? And there, to just take a broader point, social media companies want to have it both ways, and so do politicians. And of course, that's kind of the perfect recipe for conflict. Social media companies said, "Hey, we're like the post office. We just deliver the package. We're not responsible for the content." But then they have started to edit the materials in the sense that they've annotated it and with their own sort of fact checking. And not just that, the fact checking sites that were at some point actual fact checkers are themselves politically motivated at times. And in the case of Trump's tweet, the first two references were by CNN and the Washington Post that have in the past been accused of have a political bias. And I at least CNN, absolutely. Over the last couple of years, they have shifted from being a news organization to interpreting the news quite actively. And so, if the first reference is by CNN of a fact check, yeah, it's not surprising that somebody is offended by that. The question there is if Twitter, more so than Facebook, is automating that sort of the fact checking or does some sort of crowdsourcing of it. I actually think it's intriguing and it's interesting from a technology point of view. But of course, the criticism will be that, well, who develops these algorithms and are these algorithms biased and whatnot? And so it's kind of a lose-lose situation for the social media company. So they want to have freedom of speech, but then they want to edit. And then, of course, from the politician side, they also want to have their cake and eat it because they complain about all these things. But at the same time, they don't put in place regulations. Let's take the post office, right? The packages, yes, they're not responsible for the content. But what about you've all received packages that contain lithium batteries or other batteries or certain gases? There are certain things that aren't allowed to be mailed in a certain way. And there's regulation on that. There's regulation that's then imposed on the shipper saying, hey, you must not put this into a box. Now, in the US, we don't have those sort of regulations. Now, will there be an increase in regulations? Well, possibly. Now, the thing to know about regulations is that they tend to benefit the incumbent. Twitter and Facebook are perfectly capable of dealing with regulations. They're big enough. The problem is with the next startup. The next startup may not be able to deal with all the red tape. I'm just looking at my own industry. Obviously, it's a little different when you deal with other people's money. There is a valid argument to be made that there is some regulation. But the barriers to entry to some of the stuff that we do are just incredibly high. Nobody in their right mind would probably go into some of the sub industries that we're involved in. And I don't know whether we would if we were kind of many years back and were to try to do the same thing. And so regulations protect the incumbent, but politicians, yes, they need to make up their mind where they want to be. Now, in the meantime, of course, where they want to be is they want to be at the complaining end of things. What does it mean for these social media companies? Well, they'll have higher expenses, right? The fixed cost of doing business is going up. But ultimately, all these things are an opportunity, and so we will argue about them until we're green in our faces, and we'll take certain sides and whatnot. I think we all agree it's a bit of a mess. Also, just kind of on a personal note, as many of you are aware. My speech is regulated. When I talk to you, I'm amongst other regulators that are keeping an eye on what I say. Is the Securities and Exchange Commission, because we provide investment advice, and so I am not allowed to say many things. Mostly, I'm not allowed to say many radical things. And if I look around the internet at my peers, they don't abide by that. including those who are regulated and provide investment advice. There's a regulation, for example, or a guidance by the SEC that when you talk about cryptocurrencies, that you're supposed to give an array of disclosures because they are not appropriate for most investors. See, listen to those little names. I have said that because when you mention cryptocurrencies, you're supposed to say that, right? And then you see people with tweets who promote them, or take something like gold, right? We talk about gold a lot because that's a market we deal with, but we must not tell you to buy gold. That's just not allowed by regulation because I do not know your specific investment situation. And so what we can say is we can say that this environment has historically shown to be positive for gold. We can say that certain factors are positive, certain factors are negative. We may even say that you might want to consider something like that. But there are others in this industry that say, hey, buy. Now, there are many others who are not regulated. And so for the consumer to know the difference who is regulated and who is not, you see the same thing watching CNBC. When you hear the word contributor, that means somebody is being paid by CNBC to be a guest, and the guest is not. Many contributors are not regulated. Some of them are. Most guests are. And so they talk differently, they say different things. It's very difficult. So it becomes a mesh, a complex mesh. And I mention that because when you kind of now flip that over to the social media side, you will see behavior and conduct by these companies that are due to the regulators or for liability protection. And so if you're policy buff, that could be fascinating. If you're in the industry, it's exhausting. And if you're a consumer, you're kind of oblivious to all of it and you just do your thing and are wondering of how this is all going to play out. I would actually think that the quote unquote fact checking, I don't know whether Twitter's onto that. I had the feeling when I checked out the fact checks of the presidential tweet that they were using an algorithm to put together people disputing the issue. He said, and I think that's kind of a fun way of doing it. That let the blogosphere battle it out. But of course, in some ways, that's of course what the timeline is meant to do in the first place, right? I mean, anybody who disagrees with a presidential tweet can hit a response and say, hey, this is wrong. And it happens. It happens all the time. And so, does it really require somebody else to do it? And of course, there are folks who say, well, maybe yes, it's because if you have a tweet that gets tens of thousands of retweets, and then your reply might go under. Well, yes, I feel strongly about certain things, but I don't have the megaphone because I'm not the president, right? That's why you have a president who has the bigger megaphone, and so we kind of have to respect what this fellow says, and then we can say whatever we want. And so it seems like we're just upset that we can't express our opinion as loudly as the other guys can. And so if we control the platform, do we have the right then to tweak it by adding a little label underneath? Anyway, I think I'm talking myself into here to saying that this is a slippery slope, but what else is new? Anyway, as I talk here, the dollar is weakening a little further. These are not huge moves. Well, 110.47 for the euro now, so that's moving ahead a little bit. Gold is now up 70 basis points, and S&P futures are flattish. By the way, one thing to keep in mind is we had a brief chat in our briefing this morning about how European stocks at the time, at least, were ahead of much of the rest of the world, and why that is the case. And let me just get back here to the board and see whether that is still the case. If my Bloomberg were a little faster, that seems to be, generally speaking, still the case, with the exception of Tokyo, that was up because of this massive stimulus. But the Swiss market is up 2%, for example. The US stocks is up 1.1%, whereas the US is more flattish. And so these different markets have different compositions. Swiss market, well, Roche, pharmaceutical company, had an agreement with Gilead that they're going to be jointly working on the trial for a vaccine. Again, no investment recommendation, but my guess is that's part of it because Roche is up quite a bit today. And also you have more industrial companies in Europe, and you have more social media or high-tech, otherwise high-tech companies. And we've had a tremendous divergence in some of these sectors where the new economy type of companies have been doing incredibly well. And of course, now if you get hit with a presidential tweet, and with that may put a dampener on some of those market leaders. Good. So that's about it. I could talk about Brazil here briefly. Brazilian real is down 1.5%. Brazil is a big mess, has been a big mess. They don't have the virus under control. Brazil constitutionally has a big challenge that their social benefits are tied to inflation, and so that just makes it very difficult in a country where it has good, decent inflation to get the to get the household in order. Now, obviously, if you're a consumer, well, all means, yeah, let's have our social benefits be indexed to inflation. But if you have an economy that's in the hole and have expenses that are too high everywhere, you've got to cut costs somewhere, and you cannot do it on the benefits, and they have a lot of entitlements there, and so that's a bit of a challenge when you can't afford to have them. And then, of course, out of that, they get whacked quite a bit here with the virus. CNH, by the way, I see here the board is up 20 basis points at 7.1617, so above 7. CNH is the offshore, is the offshore Chinese currency. All right, that is it then. I'll try again to wrap it up. Let me just see if there's anything else I wanted to say. I see the 10-year in a very, very narrow range. I have to double check of what's happening here. Been hovering. Oh, it has been in a narrow range. That is correct, but that's over the last couple of weeks. The scale here is wrong, but still, yeah. Today also in a narrow range. Good. Alrighty. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Hopefully next time around. Take care. Bye bye.